There's essentially a whole generation of medical students who don't know the story. The story has such powerful lessons that I think that's a tragedy. The epidemiology and biostatistics program here is very large. It's one of the largest chronic disease programs in the world, and there are multiple opportunities to study multiple exposures and multiple cancers. And it's been my privilege to be able to do a lot in a lot of different areas. But there has been one theme that's been sort of common throughout from my thesis till now, which has been a very long time, and that's hormonal carcinogenesis, the relationship between hormones and cancer, which explains some of the reason that I was so involved with the DES story as well. Diethylstilbestrol, or DES, was the first synthetic estrogen ever made, happened in 1938. Shortly thereafter, it was actually used in humans, in pregnant women, to prevent complications of pregnancy. And in the early 1950s, there were 4 clinical trials done to assess the efficacy of DES. It was determined that it actually did not prevent adverse outcomes of pregnancy. Unfortunately, while the use started to decline, it wasn't stopped. It was continued in the late 1960s at the Mass General Hospital in Boston. A number of young women, adolescents and young adult women, showed up on the wards with a very unusual cancer that, when it occurs, almost always occurs in very old women. The classic story of the alert clinician. And in this case, it was the alert clinicians being alert to an alert mother who actually, at the bedside, asked if this could possibly have something to do with the drug she took during pregnancy. And they rapidly followed up on that, and rapidly followed up on it with their other cases and cases that they knew about in other parts of the world. There were a flurry of studies done, mainly clinical and a lot of laboratory studies, and a few epidemiologic investigations. When these studies were actually stopping, I thought that that would be a tragedy, because this exposure was likely to have effects that we didn't know about. We didn't know about mainly because we didn't have enough large enough sample size, or we didn't know about because we hadn't followed them long enough. So in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I got the investigators together from these original studies to see if they would be interested in combining forces, basically putting all these studies together into one big study that would have enough statistical power. So the paper is actually a summary of all of the adverse health outcomes that we have linked to DES, and we're giving not only relative risks, you're twice as likely to get it, you're 5 times as likely, but for the first time we've calculated cumulative risks. What is your sort of absolute risk? What percent of all exposed women are going to have this outcome, and what percent of them are having them because of their exposure? It has many lessons also, and certainly the one that jumps right out at you is the value of clinical trials and paying attention to them, particularly not treating someone with a drug for a condition for which it hasn't been demonstrated to be any good. So this is also a very good example of the special vulnerability of the fetus and very early life exposures. This is a time when you can do a lot of harm, because a lot of things are just being programmed for the rest of your life. But the most important lesson to be learned from this, from the clinician's point of view, is the value and need for post-marketing surveillance of drugs. The only reason we know what we know now about the full scope of the adverse effects of DES is because the first one was a very unusual tumor occurring in a very unusual group that instantaneously raised people's awareness that something odd is here going on here. What was the cause of that? For about 20 years now, When I standardly ask in my general epidemiology lecture, when we're talking about drug epidemiology, I ask, how many of you have heard of DES? Nobody raises their hand. So maybe this will help for those people, and to just tell them the story, maybe if they'll hear it for the first time and learn the lessons from it.